He never told anyone who he used to be. That was the rule. One rule, quietly made the night he drove out of Geneva with a 6-week-old baby strapped in the back seat and 23 years of ambition folded up somewhere behind his ribs. He didn't announce anything, didn't post, didn't reply to the 14 emails from the company's head of development asking him to reconsider. He just left. And for 5 years, no one found him. The town of Milford, Ohio wasn't the kind of place people came looking for things. It was the kind of place people landed when the looking was over. 2 traffic lights. A diner that opened at 5 and closed when Marie felt like it. A hardware store that had been run by the same family since 1962. And at the corner of Dayton and Route 9, a small garage with a hand-painted sign that read, Mercer Auto, Service and Repair. The sign had taken Jake 3 evenings to paint. Noah had supervised from a red plastic step stool, very seriously suggesting that the letters needed to be bigger, then smaller, then a different color entirely. Jake had kept them the same. Inside the garage, everything had a place. Torque wrenches hung in descending order. Oil rags folded in thirds. A whiteboard on the east wall tracked open jobs. Nothing fancy, just names and dates in black marker. He had regulars. Mr. Kowalski's Buick every spring. The Hendersons' van, which burned through rear brake pads faster than any vehicle Jake had ever seen. A growing list of word-of-mouth customers who'd heard that Mercer Auto was the place to go if you wanted it done right and didn't want to be talked down to. He charged fair. He explained what he found. He didn't upsell. At 3:15 every afternoon, he walked the 4 blocks to Milford Elementary and picked up his son. Noah was 6. He had his mother's forehead and Jake's hands. Wide palms, already curious, always reaching. He asked questions the way some kids throw rocks, constantly, without aiming, just to see what they hit. On the walk home, he talked about everything. A bug he'd found by the fence. A disagreement at lunch about whether a hot dog was technically a sandwich. Whether cars could have feelings. Jake answered everything. Every single question. It was, he thought on some evenings when Noah was asleep and the garage was quiet, the best part of his life. The most honest part. He didn't miss Geneva. Or he told himself he didn't. Sometimes late at night when he was working a difficult job, something stubborn, something that refused to cooperate, his hands would move in ways that surprised even him. Faster. More precise. Patterns laid down over years, over thousands of hours, waking up like muscle memory always does. And in those moments, some quiet version of himself would surface. The one who had spent 3 years reconstructing the combustion geometry of a 1966 Ferrari 275 GTB just to understand how Enzo's engineers had been thinking. The one who had published a 47-page paper on harmonic resonance failures in vintage V12 engines that got passed around certain circles like something sacred. That version of himself was still in there. He just kept the door shut. The delivery came on a Thursday. Jake had sent Noah with the parts list the week before. 3 items, standard order, nothing unusual. But the supplier had shorted them on the gasket set, so Jake drove out to Apex Motors' parts distribution center himself, Noah in the passenger seat, to sort it out in person. Apex Motors was a different world. Glass and steel, the kind of building that existed to remind you of what it cost to walk through the door. The reception area smelled like new leather and money. Behind the counter, a woman with perfect posture typed without looking up. Jake explained the discrepancy, showed the invoice. It was a simple fix, a line item error, probably a scanning mistake at the warehouse. That's when Brad Connors walked through the side door. He was the head of technical operations. Jake knew the title from the invoice header. Mid-40s, the kind of build that suggested he'd once been athletic and now wore expensive clothes to suggest he still was. He glanced at Jake once, at Noah, at Jake's hands, which still had engine grease in the knuckles from the morning. "This the guy from the walk-in?" Brad asked the receptionist. "He has a delivery discrepancy." "Yeah, I can see what he is." Brad didn't look at Jake when he said it. He looked at the paperwork, then past Jake's shoulder. "We're not a charity counter. If the order's wrong, file a form. We'll get to it in 7 to 10 business days." "There's no form for this," Jake said. His voice was even. "It's a fulfillment error on your side. I just need the 3 gaskets." "You got a commercial account?" "No." Brad smiled. Not a friendly smile. "Then you wait in line like everyone else. We're not rushing paperwork for a 2-bay shop." He paused just long enough for it to land. "Some of us have real work to do." He walked back through the side door. The receptionist looked at her keyboard. Jake looked at the space where Brad had been standing. His jaw tightened once. Held. Noah tugged at his sleeve. "Dad." "Yeah." Why was he like that? Jake crouched down to Noah's level. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Through the glass wall behind them, a row of restored cars gleamed like trophies. "Some people," Jake said, "decide who you are before they know anything about you." Noah thought about it. Is that his fault or ours? His. "So what do we do?" Jake looked at his son for a moment, at those wide, serious eyes. "Nothing today," he said. "There are things you don't need to say. You just need to do." They filed the form. They waited 7 business days. They got their gaskets. Jake never mentioned it again. But Noah remembered. Megan Hartley had been CEO of Apex Motors for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. She knew the number because her therapist had pointed it out, that she kept track of time in units of survival. 3 years, 4 months, 11 days since she'd walked into a company in freefall. A board that had 3 different factions pulling in 4 different directions, a workforce that had seen 2 CEOs in 18 months, and a brand that had been coasting on legacy for a decade without anyone admitting it. She was 37. She'd taken the role at 34. She had not slept 8 consecutive hours since. Apex Motors dealt in the rare end of the market: restorations, acquisitions, and private sales of collector automobiles. The kind of cars that didn't depreciate. The kind that people flew across continents to see. Megan had grown the revenue from $11 million to $43 million in 3 years. She'd done it by being the first person in the building every morning and understanding very precisely which risks were worth taking. The Harrington exhibition was a risk she'd calculated carefully. Victor Harrington was 71 years old, a private collector with a portfolio that represented the dreams of roughly 40 years of obsessive, disciplined acquisition. He had contacted Apex in February with a single request. He needed his 1971 Lamborghini Miura S fully assessed, mechanically certified, and presented at the Northeast Collectors Summit in Cleveland on October 14th. If that went well, the subsequent sale and management contract was worth $4.8 million. Megan had said yes before the call was over. She had assigned Brad Connor's team to the car. She had checked in twice a week for 6 weeks. She had been told each time that everything was on track. On October 11th, 72 hours before the exhibition, the Miura S stopped running. The first mechanic spent 11 hours on the car. He identified a fuel delivery inconsistency and adjusted the carburetors. The car ran for 4 minutes. Then it stopped. The second team, 3 technicians, 14 hours, concluded the ignition timing was the issue. They rebuilt the distributor, reset the timing to spec. The car ran for 6 minutes. Then it stopped. The third specialist Megan called in was a vintage Lamborghini consultant based in Pittsburgh who charged $3,000 a day. He flew in on a private commuter at 6 a.m. He worked through the night. At 4 a.m., he told her he couldn't find it. "Can't find what?" Megan asked. "Whatever's wrong." He had the kind of face that didn't admit defeat easily. He looked defeated. "The symptoms don't match any documented failure mode. It's like the engine is fighting itself." "That's not an answer." "I know." She stood in the garage bay at 4:17 a.m., the Miura S gleaming under the fluorescent work lights, copper and gold, one of only 140 ever built, with the transverse V12 behind the seats and the kind of lines that made engineers 40 years younger than it feel humble. It was possibly the most important car Megan had touched in her professional life. And it was dead. 48 hours left. She went back to her office. She pulled up every documentation thread her team had on the car. Provenance records, previous restoration notes, a 2009 Sotheby's assessment, and then, buried in a database of technical research that one of her junior analysts had compiled 2 years ago, a single paper, downloaded but never read. Resonance failure in vintage V12 configurations, a case study in Rinaldi engine architecture. The author was listed as J. Mercer, formerly of Cavalcade Automotive Engineering, Geneva. She read the abstract standing up. Then she read the whole paper. Then she sat down. Then she typed his name into every database she had access to. Jake Mercer had left Cavalcade in 2019. No forwarding employer, no LinkedIn, no conference appearances after March of that year. He had, to all visible evidence, simply stopped existing in the professional world. It took her analyst 45 minutes and a freelance background search to find the garage on Dayton and Route 9, Milford, Ohio. Mercer Auto, Service and Repair. She stared at the satellite image for a long moment. Her coffee was cold. Outside, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges. She grabbed her coat. Jake was under a 2007 Silverado when he heard the knock. Not on the front door, on the bay door, which meant whoever it was had walked around the side of the building. He rolled out from under the truck, sat up, and saw a woman in a dark overcoat standing at the entrance. Behind her, a black Range Rover was parked along the curb with its hazards on. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her hair was pulled back but loose in places. She was holding a folder, and the way she was holding it, both hands tight, told him she wasn't sure she was going to be welcome. He'd seen that look before. Not often, but he recognized it. "Jake Mercer?" she said. "Yeah. My name is Megan Hartley." She paused. "I'm the CEO of Apex Motors." Something shifted in him. Nothing visible. He wiped his hands on the rag at his belt. "I know who you are," he said. She flinched, just slightly. "Then you probably know why I'm here." "The Miura?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. The morning was cold, mid-October, the light still gray and thin. From upstairs, he could hear the sound of Noah moving around in the kitchen. "Come in," he said. Inside, he poured 2 cups of coffee, set hers on the workbench, didn't offer to sit, there was only one chair, and he leaned against the bench while she stood. She explained it clearly. No deflection, no spin. The car, the exhibition, the 3 failed attempts, the timeline. 44 hours. She laid the folder open on the bench. The Sotheby's assessment, the technical notes, his own paper printed out with passages underlined. She was, he noticed, someone who did her homework. "I need to say something before I ask anything," Megan said. He waited. "You were here 3 weeks ago, with your son." She held his gaze. "What Brad said to you? There's no version of that was acceptable. I was in the building. I didn't intervene. That's on me." She stopped. "I'm sorry." The garage was quiet. Somewhere outside, a car passed on Route 9. "He still works there," Jake said. "He does." A pause. "He won't be in a position to speak to anyone that way again." Jake looked at his coffee, set it down, picked up the folder and read through the technical notes slowly, not performing, just reading. Halfway through the second page, something changed in his posture, subtle. His shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch, his eyes stilled. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes. The car's been running and cutting out. Not failing to start. Running, then stopping." "Correct. Under load or at idle?" "Both." She crossed her arms. "But the duration at idle is longer." His jaw moved. Not quite a smile. Something more internal than that. Your team's been chasing symptoms, he said. Fuel, ignition, timing, all logical. All wrong. What is it? He looked up. I'd need to see it. I have a car outside. He looked toward the stairs. Thought for a moment. Give me 10 minutes, he said. He went upstairs. Noah was at the kitchen table, a bowl of cereal going soft in front of him, reading a book about deep-sea creatures. I've got to go in for a job tonight, Jake said. Noah looked up. He had his mother's way of reading a room. Is it something hard? Yeah. Will you be back before school? I'll try. Jake crouched down. If I'm not, Mrs. Patterson next door has a key. You know the drill. Dad, Noah said it in the tone he used when he was about to be very 6 years old and very grown up at the same time. Is it the lady with the Range Rover? Jake looked at him. I saw from the window, Noah said. She looked like she needed help. Jake held his son's face for a second, kissed the top of his head. Yeah, he said. She does. The car was magnificent. Even quiet, even still, even surrounded by the fluorescent hum of the Apex service bay at 9 p.m., with 3 frustrated technicians' worth of diagnostic equipment still attached to it. It was magnificent. Jake walked around it once, didn't touch it, just looked. The copper-gold coachwork, the side gill vents, the pop-up headlights folded back into the hood like sleeping eyes. The Miura S had been the fastest production car in the world when it debuted in 1966. 59 years later, it still looked like something from ahead of its time. He crouched at the rear, looked at the transverse V12 through the engine cover. Someone had been very thorough. The distributor was new, the carb jets were clean, the timing marks were exactly where they should be. All wrong. He stood up and found Megan beside him. Can I start it? He asked. She handed him the key. It caught on the first turn. The V12 found its idle, that unmistakable rolling, overlapping pulse that sounded less like combustion and more like music, like something breathing. For 34 seconds, it was perfect. Then, very quietly, it began to fight itself. Not stall, not cut out, fight. A vibration that spread from the block outward, subtle at first, then not subtle. And then, with a sound like a held breath releasing, it stopped. Jake sat in the silence for a moment after. You hear that? He said. What? Megan asked. Before it stopped, that frequency. He tapped his sternum. Not for effect. He was locating it. About 23 hertz, right there. She stared at him. He was already walking to the bench for a flashlight. What Jake Mercer understood about Maurizio Rinaldi, understood in a way that most engineers, most restorers, most expensive consultants didn't, was that Rinaldi hadn't just designed engines. He'd designed systems. Everything connected to everything. The geometry of the block, the angle of the heads, the specific length of the intake runners. None of it was accidental, and none of it could be changed in isolation without consequences that were difficult to trace. Rinaldi had published almost nothing. He'd worked inside Lamborghini's Sant'Agata factory from 1963 to 1974 and left without fanfare, and the mechanics of how he thought had died largely with him. What remained were the cars themselves, and for anyone willing to look at them long enough, really look, the way you look at a sentence until the grammar opens up, the logic was there. Jake had spent 3 years of his life looking. He worked methodically. Not frantically, methodically. He moved through each system in order, not chasing symptoms but reconstructing the original intent. He took measurements and wrote them on the notepad he'd brought from the garage. He looked at tolerances. He looked at angles. He put his hand on the block and felt the temperature distribution from the last start, still warm and uneven in a pattern that told him something. At 1:17 a.m., he found it. A single mounting bracket, original Rinaldi, untouched by any of the 3 previous teams because it looked completely intact. And it was intact mechanically. but over 54 years, it had shifted 0.3 millimeters. A third of a millimeter, less than the thickness of 3 sheets of paper. It had moved the position of the secondary oil feed line by an amount that was invisible to the eye and irrelevant under static conditions. But under the specific thermal expansion of a running V12, at operating temperature, that shift created a micro-interruption in pressure delivery to the right bank's number 4 and 5 bearings, once per second, at intervals that precisely matched the harmonic frequency of the block. The engine wasn't failing. It was resonating itself into failure. Every time it reached operating temperature, the resonance built until the bearing pressure dropped below threshold and the engine's own protection system shut it down. Jake sat back, wrote it out in full on the notepad, read it back to himself once. Then he got up and walked to where Megan was sitting on a stool by the far wall, both hands wrapped around a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "Found it," he said. She looked at him. Her eyes were very still. "How long to fix?" she said. He looked at the clock on the wall. 1:21 a.m. 2.5 hours, he said. Maybe 3. The exhibition opens at 9. Then we have time. She put the cold coffee down. "Tell me." He walked her through it. Every step, every measurement, every piece of logic. Not simplified. The real version. He watched her follow it, saw the moment it clicked behind her eyes. "A third of a millimeter," she said quietly. "A third of a millimeter." She looked at the car, then back at him. "Why didn't any of them find it?" Jake thought for a moment. "They were trying to understand what was broken," he said. "I was trying to understand what Rinaldi was thinking." Something moved across Megan's face. Not gratitude. Something harder and more honest than gratitude. "Get to work," she said. The work was quiet. That was what she remembered afterward. Not the tension, not the precision, not even the result. The quiet. Jake worked the way very few people do anything. Completely. No music. No conversation that wasn't about the car. His movements were economical in a way that felt almost choreographed, but not performed. Just deeply practiced, the way a musician's hands move through something they've played 10,000 times. Megan sat and watched and didn't speak. Around 2:40 a.m., he asked her to hand him the 8mm wrench. She found it without him pointing. She didn't know why she'd known which one he meant. She handed it across and he took it without looking up. They did not talk about Brad Connors. They did not talk about the $4.8 million contract. They did not talk about Geneva. They talked, briefly, about Noah. "He sounds like a good kid," she said at one point. "He is." A pause. The sound of a torque wrench clicking into place. "He asked me once if cars could feel things." "What did you tell him?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "I told him I didn't know." She looked at the Miura S. "What do you actually think?" He looked up then, just briefly. The corner of his mouth moved. "I think some of them remember," he said. At 3:44 a.m., he torqued the last fastener to spec. He did it with the kind of finality that a period has at the end of a long sentence. He stepped back, looked at the car. "Start it," he said. Megan got behind the wheel. Her hands were not shaking. She was surprised to realize that. She turned the key. The V12 caught. That rolling, overlapping pulse rose into the garage. The acoustics of the high-ceiling bay filled with something that sounded like a held note in a concert hall, full and round and uninterrupted. It ran. It ran at idle for 2 minutes, then 3, then 5. Jake was crouched by the rear, his hand on the body, reading the vibration through his palm. Completely still, eyes closed. At 7 minutes, he stood up. "Take it around the block," he said. She looked at him. "Now?" "The bearing pressure has to be verified under load. Take it around the block." She drove the 1971 Lamborghini Miura S out of the service bay of Apex Motors at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. The streets of the warehouse district were empty. The streetlights made the copper-gold coachwork burn. The V12, all 3.9 liters, all 12 cylinders, all of Rinaldi's geometry restored to its original intent, opened up on the long straight of Industrial Parkway and sounded like something that had no business being alive and was alive anyway. She came back in 8 minutes. She got out of the car and stood beside it in the empty lot, the engine ticking as it cooled, the exhaust ghosting in the cold October air. Jake was waiting at the bay door. "Well?" he said. She couldn't speak for a moment. "It's perfect," she said. He nodded once, picked up his bag. "Send the invoice to the garage," he said. "Standard rate." "Jake." She said his name with a weight that stopped him. "Standard rate isn't happening." He looked at her. "You saved something tonight that 6 people with more credentials than you couldn't save." She held his gaze. "You're getting paid what it's worth." He was quiet. "And I have a second thing to say," she continued. "Victor Harrington is going to be at that exhibition tomorrow. He is going to want to know who fixed his car. I'm going to tell him the truth. I thought you should know that." Jake looked at the Miura S for a moment, looked at the dark street, looked at her. "Okay," he said. He walked to the Range Rover that her driver had waiting. Got in, was gone. Megan stood in the lot for a long time after. The engine had finished ticking. The air smelled like exhaust and cold and something she couldn't name. She thought about a paper with underlined passages, about 1/3 of a millimeter, about a 6-year-old boy on a red plastic step stool supervising hand-painted letters. She went inside. The Northeast Collectors Summit occupied the Grand Hall of the Cleveland Convention Center. By 9:30 a.m., 340 people had filtered through the doors. Collectors, restorers, journalists, the particular kind of wealthy who treated automobiles as both investments and religions. The Apex Motors Bay occupied a prime corner of the hall. 4 cars were displayed, but only one had gathered a crowd that pressed 6 people deep, phones up, voices low in the way people speak around something that commands reverence. The 1971 Lamborghini Miura S. It sat under warm lighting on a platform that matched its height, the coachwork lit from 3 angles so the copper-gold paint moved when you moved. A placard beside it stated the provenance in clean type. Megan stood near the edge of the crowd, watching, her hands folded. Victor Harrington arrived at 10:15. He was shorter than she'd imagined, with white hair and a cane he used intermittently and seemed to resent. He walked directly to the car, did not look at the placard, placed one hand on the driver's door, gently, the way you'd touch something you thought you'd lost, and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. Then he opened them, found Megan. "You fixed her," he said. "Yes." "Who?" She told him. He listened with very still attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "J. Mercer," he said. "The resonance paper. You've read it." "I've read everything." He looked back at the car. "I thought he'd left the field." He did. "Why?" He had a son to raise. Victor Harrington was quiet for a long time. The crowd shifted around them. Somewhere across the hall, a woman laughed at something her companion said. The light moved across the Miura's hood. "I'd like to reach out to him," Harrington said finally. "I'll give you his number," Megan said. "He answers when he wants to." Brad Connors received his reassignment notice on the same morning. Not a termination. Megan had considered it and decided it was more honest to demote than to erase. He was moved from head of technical operations to senior inventory coordinator. No customer contact. No external representation. He asked for a meeting. She gave him 3 minutes in the doorway of her office. "This is because of that garage guy," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "This is because of what you said to him in front of his child," she said. And because you spent 6 weeks telling me a project was on track when it wasn't. He was a walk-in. He was the only person in the world who could fix that car. She looked at him with something that was not anger, something colder and more final. And you would have known that, if you'd looked. She closed the door. The invoice Jake submitted was for $420. Labor, 8 hours at $50 an hour. Parts, 20. Mileage, flat fee. Megan looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote a check for $12,000, attached a note that said only, "This is closer to what it was worth. The rest you're owed in ways money doesn't cover." She had it couriered to Mercer Auto on Dayton and Route 9. Victor Harrington sent a handwritten letter. 2 paragraphs. He had a collection of 9 significant automobiles with documented Rinaldi provenance. He was looking for someone who understood them not just mechanically, but architecturally. He wasn't asking Jake to leave his life. He was asking Jake to consider whether his life might be large enough to hold more than one thing. The letter came on a Thursday. Jake read it at the workbench with the garage door open, the October air coming through in the particular way it does in Ohio when the leaves have mostly fallen and the light goes gold and flat before 4 in the afternoon. He read it twice. He put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up Noah from school at 3:15. It was the second Saturday of November when Megan saw them. She hadn't planned it. She'd taken a different route through Milford on her way to a site visit. The company had a storage facility nearby, and she'd been in the area for 20 minutes when she'd turned onto the street that ran beside the park. And there they were. Jake was on a bench. Noah was on the climbing structure, the tall one with the rope bridge, negotiating something complicated with a boy roughly his age. From a distance, she watched Jake watch his son. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't reading, just watching, with the focused, unhurried attention he gave to everything. She parked and walked over. He saw her coming from 30 feet away. Did not look surprised. "Hey," she said. "Hey." She sat on the other end of the bench, a reasonable distance, and they both watched Noah cross the rope bridge with the careful intensity of someone who had decided this mattered. "He okay?" Megan asked. "He's perfect," Jake said. Then, after a moment, "You look different." She thought about it. "I slept 8 hours 2 nights ago." "First time in a while?" "First time in a long time." The rope bridge swayed. Noah made it across. He looked down at his father with something that might have been triumph, and Jake raised one hand. A quiet salute. Nothing more. "Harrington reached out to you," Megan said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." "Are you going to answer?" Jake was quiet for a moment. A leaf drifted across the path in front of them. The sun was low and the shadows were long. "I don't know yet," he said. "Noah's got another 1.5 years before school gets serious. I want to be around for that. Those things don't have to be mutually exclusive." "I know." He looked at his son. "It's not about capability. It's about—" He paused, searching. "It's about what you're available for. You can only be fully available for so many things." She thought about her calendar, her phone, the 347 unread emails she'd decided this morning to mostly ignore. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what you said in the garage, about how your team was chasing symptoms and you were trying to understand what Rinaldi was thinking." "Yeah. That's not a mechanical principle. That's a philosophy." He glanced at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite amusement, not quite surprise. Recognition, maybe. "It applies to most things," he said. "I know." She looked at her hands. "I've been running a company for 3 years trying to fix symptoms." He didn't say anything. He let the silence be what it was. "I came here to say something," Megan said. "I don't want to make it more than it is. But if you ever decide you want to do the larger work, the Harrington collection or anything like it, I want to be useful to you. Not as your employer, just—" She searched for the word. as someone who got it wrong about you once and would like to be part of getting it right. Jake looked at her for a moment. She had the uncomfortable, clarifying sensation of being seen precisely. That means something, he said. Okay, I'll think about the Harrington thing. Okay. On the climbing structure, Noah had reached the top platform and was now surveying the park with the proprietorial satisfaction of a 6-year-old who has decided that altitude equals authority. He spotted Megan and stared for a moment. Then he waved. She waved back. He remembered you, Jake said. I remembered him too, she said. She stood to go. He didn't try to extend it. Jake. She paused. For what it's worth, what you said to him that day at the parts counter, there are things you don't need to say. You just need to do. He told me when I came to the garage. She stopped. I've been trying to live by that. Jake looked up at her. He didn't say anything, but something eased in his face. Something that had been held for a long time. She walked back to her car. He watched his son come down from the platform. Noah ran across the grass and arrived at the bench slightly out of breath, cheeks red, declaring that he had made it across the rope bridge 7 times. 7, Jake said. That's the record, right? It is now, Noah said with complete confidence. Jake put his arm around his son. The sun kept going down. The park kept being a park. Somewhere in the pocket of his jacket, a letter from Victor Harrington waited with the patience of something that knew it had already changed things simply by existing. Jake did not make any decisions that afternoon, but for the first time in 5 years, he let himself think about what he might say yes to. And that was enough. The Miura S sold at the Northeast Collectors Summit that same afternoon, not through Apex, but through Harrington directly, to a private buyer from Zurich who paid just over $7 million for a car that, 3 days earlier, no one could make run. Jake heard about it from Harrington's letter. He read the number twice. Then he went back to work. There is a certain kind of quiet that isn't absence. It's the quiet of someone who has made a choice, not the loud choice, the one people celebrate, but the smaller one. The one where you look at what matters most and you build your whole life around it. Where you walk away from the room everyone's trying to get into, because something outside that room needs you more. Jake Mercer fixed engines for a living. He painted signs with his son. He walked 4 blocks every afternoon at 3:15. He was the most important person in one small person's life. That is not a small thing. That is not a lesser thing. That is, in ways that are difficult to fully quantify, everything. But the door was open now, and Jake Mercer had never been afraid of what was behind a door he hadn't opened yet. He was only afraid of leaving the important things unfinished. And the most important thing, the boy on the rope bridge, the boy asking questions about cars and feelings and why some people decide who you are before they know you. That one was going beautifully. So maybe, Jake thought on the drive home, there was room. Maybe there was room for one more thing. If this story found something in you, share it with someone who needed to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me, whose quiet sacrifice have you been underestimating? Every story we share is for the person who works without applause, builds without credit, and loves without asking to be seen. Subscribe and hit the bell, because your support is the only reason these stories get made. Thank you. For real. There is a version of October 10th that Jake Mercer never talks about. The version where he sat at the kitchen table at midnight, Noah asleep upstairs, and looked at his hands under the single lamp by the window. He'd been working on a 2001 Tacoma all afternoon, a cracked head gasket, a straightforward job, nothing that required him to think very hard. His hands had done it almost without him. That was the strange part of this life he'd built. How much of it he could do without being fully present. How often his mind drifted somewhere else while his hands moved through the familiar work. He thought about Geneva sometimes, not with longing exactly, more the way you think about a language you used to speak, with the low-grade awareness that fluency, once abandoned, goes strange. That the vocabulary is still in there somewhere, but the syntax has gone soft. He had been very good, he knew that. Not arrogantly, just factually, the way a person knows which direction is north. He had spent 11 years at Cavalcade Automotive Engineering, and in that time had done work that a small number of people in the world recognized as significant, and a larger number had no framework to understand. He had redesigned the thermal management system on a limited production Grand Tourer. He had written papers that were cited in graduate programs he'd never visited. He had sat in rooms with engineers whose names he'd grown up reading and held his own. He had walked away from all of it on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2019, with a 6-week-old baby and a storage unit of books he'd never unpack. People asked him, the rare times it came up, whether he missed it. He always said he didn't have time to miss things. That was true in the practical sense. Noah required all of him, not occasionally, not in bursts, but continuously, the way anything alive requires attention. The first year had been survival. The second had been rhythm. By the third year, Jake had understood that what he was building wasn't a temporary arrangement until he figured out what came next. It was the thing itself. This was the work. But that midnight in October, hands on the kitchen table, the Tacoma finished and rinsed in the bay below, he'd felt something shift. Not regret. Something less simple than regret. More like a question he hadn't asked himself in a long time and didn't yet know how to answer. He went to bed without answering it. 12 hours later, a woman in a dark overcoat knocked on his bay door. In the weeks after the exhibition, Megan asked 2 people about Jake Mercer. Not people who knew him now, people who had known him before. The first was a former colleague at Cavalcade named Soren Holt, who now ran a vintage racing consultancy out of Stuttgart. She found his contact through a mutual connection. He agreed to a 20-minute call. Jake Mercer, Soren said, in the particular way that someone says a name when they mean something more than just the name. I spent 3 years in the same building as him. We overlapped on a project in 2017, a restoration consultation for a private collection in Lucerne. You want to know the honest thing about Jake? Yes, Megan said. He was the kind of engineer who made the rest of us feel like we'd been doing it wrong. Soren paused. Not dismissively. He didn't have that in him. He saw things differently. He would look at something the rest of us had given up on and find a thread, some tiny inconsistency in the logic, and pull it until the whole thing came apart in a way you could understand. He was a systems thinker, rarest kind. Why do you think he left? Megan asked. Soren was quiet for a moment. His wife died. Her name was Claire. She was an architect. She got sick very fast. 15 months from diagnosis. He took the last 4 months of her life completely off work. Just off. Completely. Nobody pushed back. Nobody would have dared. Another pause. When she died, he had a newborn and nothing else. I think he decided that if he was going to do one thing completely, he was going to be a father completely. Soren paused once more. I think most of us understood. Some of us envied the clarity. Megan thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. She thought about Brad Connors looking at Jake's hands and making, in 3 seconds, every conclusion that Soren Holt had needed 3 years and a shared project to understand. She thought about the cost of that. Not to Jake. Jake, she suspected, was largely beyond being damaged by the Brad Connorses of the world. But the cost in terms of what gets missed, what the world loses because certain people decide, quickly and without evidence, what something is worth. A 0.3 millimeter bracket. A third of a millimeter. The difference between a $7 million car and a car that wouldn't run. And a man in grease-stained hands who was the only person alive who knew why. 3 days after the Cleveland exhibition, Noah asked his father a question at dinner. They were having pasta. Jake had made the sauce from scratch. He cooked the same way he did everything, without shortcuts, with the kind of attention that turned even ordinary food into something worth eating. Noah was winding spaghetti onto his fork with the focused effort of someone who had not yet made peace with the logistics of long noodles. "Dad," he said without looking up. "Yeah." "The lady at the garage. And the park. Is she your friend?" Jake considered the question. "I think she's becoming one." Noah processed this. Wound more pasta. She was the one who didn't say anything, when the mean guy was being mean. Jake set his fork down. He looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "But she came to say sorry." "She did." Noah looked up. His expression was very serious, the way it got when he was working through something that mattered. "Does that count? Saying sorry after?" Jake thought about this carefully, because Noah was asking it carefully. "It counts," he said. "It doesn't erase what happened, but it counts." Because she meant it? Because she meant it, and because she showed up. He picked up his fork again. Words without showing up are just words. Noah nodded slowly. Processed. Wound more pasta. "Okay," he said. They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, the November wind moved through the street. The garage was locked and dark. The check from Megan Hartley was on the workbench downstairs, and the letter from Victor Harrington was still in Jake's jacket pocket, which was hanging on the hook by the door. "Dad," Noah said again. "Yeah. I think she's a good person who made a bad choice." Jake looked at his son. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." "That's different from a bad person." "It's very different." Noah nodded, satisfied, and returned to the serious work of his pasta. Jake sat with the weight of that for a moment, with the simple, precise justice of a 6-year-old who had decided what kind of moral universe he was going to live in and was already doing the work of understanding how it operated. He thought about how he would tell this story to Noah one day when Noah was older, when he could understand the full shape of it. The Miura, the third of a millimeter, the man in the expensive suit who'd looked at his father's hands and seen nothing worth seeing. He thought about what he'd want Noah to understand, not the vindication. The vindication was satisfying in the shallow way that all vindication is, briefly bright and quickly cooling. What he'd want Noah to understand was the bracket, the 0.3 millimeter shift, the thing so small that 6 professionals had looked past it, and so consequential that it was the difference between a running engine and a dead one. That most things that matter are like that. Small, easy to miss, requiring a specific kind of attention that is not taught but developed, slowly, over years, through the practice of caring about the details that don't announce themselves. That the work is the work, regardless of who's watching. That you don't need to explain yourself. You just need to do. He cleared the plates, washed them while Noah finished his homework at the table, read 3 chapters of a book about ocean creatures, a shark chapter, then a cuttlefish chapter, then an anglerfish chapter, which Noah found deeply